In 1847, a doctor walked into a maternity ward in Vienna. By the end of the week, almost 1 out of every 5 mothers inside that hospital would be dead. Not because childbirth was especially difficult, not because of famine, not because of war. The doctors themselves were killing them. They just didn't know it yet. Every morning, medical students began their day performing autopsies. They cut open corpses, examined diseased organs, covered their hands in blood. Then, without washing, they walked directly into the delivery room. Hours later, healthy young women began dying. High fever, organ failure, death. The doctors blamed bad air. Some blamed God's will. Others blamed the mothers themselves. No one suspected the real killer because it was completely invisible. Then one physician made an observation so disturbing it would cost him his career. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis. He ordered every doctor to wash their hands with chlorinated lime before touching a patient. Almost overnight, the death rate collapsed. Not by a little, by nearly 90%. Thousands of lives saved by something as simple as washing hands. Today, that idea feels obvious. Of course you wash your hands. Of course hospitals use soap. Of course parents teach children to scrub before eating. But here's the strange part. For almost all of human history, people had no idea what soap actually did. They didn't know bacteria existed. They didn't know viruses existed. They didn't even know what dirt really was. And yet for nearly 5,000 years, human civilization kept making soap anyway. Kings used it, armies carried it, religions demanded it, empires taxed it, factories mass-produced it, entire fortunes were built on it. Wars interrupted its supply, cities smelled because they didn't have enough of it, and millions of people died because they refused to use it. Soap isn't just something sitting beside your sink. It quietly became one of the greatest inventions in human history. It helped double human life expectancy. It transformed medicine. It changed religion. It reshaped global trade. And today it disappears down your drain, less than 30 seconds after you pick it up. So, how did a strange mixture of ash and animal fat become one of the most important substances humanity has ever created? To answer that, we have to travel back nearly 5,000 years to a civilization built between 2 rivers, where someone accidentally discovered that dirt could fight dirt. 5,000 years before anyone knew what bacteria meant, and thousands of years before hospitals were invented, there was a people living between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what we call today Mesopotamia. They weren't trying to invent soap. They weren't looking for a way to wash their hands. They had a completely different problem. Wool. Sheep were a source of wealth, but after shearing, the wool was full of grease, mud, plant residue, and sweat. If spun in this state, the fabric became poor quality. It had to be cleaned first, and here something strange began to happen. During cooking, fire ash mixed with water, and sometimes it also mixed with animal fat. Craftsmen noticed that this mixture broke down fats with astonishing ease. The wool became cleaner. The fabrics became better. No one knew why, but everyone knew the result. The oldest known soap-like recipe didn't come from Egypt, nor from Greece. It came from Sumerian clay tablets dating back to around 2500 BCE, written in cuneiform script on clay that would survive thousands of years. The recipe was surprisingly simple: water, alkali extracted from ash, and oils or fats, then boiling until the mixture transformed completely into a new substance. It's not the bar of soap we know today, but the basic chemistry had already been born. And interestingly, the Sumerians most likely didn't use this mixture for bathing, but for washing wool, cleaning textiles, and sometimes treating certain skin diseases. The idea of cleaning the body itself wasn't the priority. After them came the Babylonians. then the Akkadians, then the Assyrians. Empires fell, but the recipe continued. Each civilization added something small and passed it on to those after it. Then the idea moved south to Egypt, and there soap began to take on a completely different role. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with cleanliness, not because it prevented disease, but because it was part of order, religion, and daily life. Priests had to wash themselves several times each day before entering temples. They shaved their entire bodies and washed them with a mixture of oils and natural alkaline salts known as natron. Natron wasn't soap in the modern sense, but it performed a very similar function, removing fat and cleaning the skin. Even during the mummification of the dead, natron was one of the most important substances used because it dries the body and prevents its decay. The same substance that helped Egyptians preserve mummies was also part of their daily cleanliness routine. But despite all that, one of soap's biggest secrets remained unknown. No one knew why it worked in the first place. It was like lighting a fire. People knew it worked, but no one understood why. And while Egypt and Mesopotamia were developing these mixtures, another civilization on the other side of the Mediterranean was writing a completely different chapter of the story. The Romans, who would transform bathing from a personal habit into an industry and into a lifestyle, would make cleanliness a public spectacle. But the paradox is that the most famous story about the discovery of soap in Rome probably never happened. If you ask most people where soap was discovered, you'll hear the same answer: Mount Sapo. The story says that animals were sacrificed on this mountain as offerings to the gods, and with every rain, ash from the fires and animal fat would flow down with the rainwater to the banks of the Tiber River. And there, women washing clothes noticed that fabrics became cleaner in this place than anywhere else. And from the mountain's name came the word soap. It's a wonderful story, simple and easy to remember. And there's just one problem. It most likely never happened. Historians searched for Mount Sapo and didn't find it. Not on Roman maps, not in ancient writings, not in military records, not even in Roman mythology itself. There is no real evidence that this mountain ever existed at all. And most researchers today believe the story appeared more than 1,000 years later as a charming attempt to explain the origin of the word soap. But the story being untrue doesn't mean the Romans didn't know soap. They did know it and used it, but not in the way we imagine. When we think of Rome, we think of public baths, marble halls, massive columns, hot water pools, and steam filling the place. Millions of people entered these baths every year. But the surprise is that most of them weren't bathing with soap. Instead, Romans oiled their bodies with olive oil. Then, after finishing exercise, or after sitting in the hot bath, they used a curved metal tool called the strigil. It scraped off the oil, and with it the sweat, dust, and dead skin, in a surprisingly effective way. If you watched this process today, it would never look comfortable. But for the Romans, it was the peak of cleanliness. In fact, some wealthy people had slaves whose only job was to scrape their bodies every day. Roman baths were more than just a place to bathe. They were a social club, and a library, and a gym, and a place to make deals, and even to discuss politics. A person might spend several hours daily inside the bath. And despite all this attention to cleanliness, soap remained a secondary product. In the 1st century AD, the Roman physician Galen wrote about a substance made from fat and ash, and noted that it might be useful for cleaning the body and for treating certain skin diseases. This is one of the oldest medical descriptions of soap in Europe. But even Galen didn't know how it worked. In truth, no one knew. People only saw the result. Dirt disappears, fats vanish, But why? No one had the answer. And more than 1,700 years would pass before scientists understood what was happening at the molecular level. Then Rome fell. The empire that ruled the Mediterranean collapsed. Roads fell apart, trade shrank, and the public baths, which had been a symbol of Roman civilization, began closing, one after another. And with their disappearance, a large part of bathing culture disappeared with them. But soap did not disappear. It moved to another place, a place that would transform it from a simple mixture of fat and ash into an industry worth a fortune. On the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, in cities like Aleppo and Damascus, craftsmen began making a new kind of soap, purer, harder, and far better than anything the Romans had known. And for the first time, soap would become a commodity, traveling thousands of kilometers just for people to buy it. While Europe was drowning in centuries of wars, epidemics, and collapsing cities, something completely different was happening thousands of kilometers to the east, in a city called Aleppo. If you entered one of Aleppo's markets 1,000 years ago, you wouldn't just see silk or spices or copper. You would smell a distinctive scent before you saw its source. The scent of olive oil mixed with laurel. A scent that became a brand before brands even existed. Aleppo's soap makers had discovered something that changed the entire industry. Instead of using animal fat, they started relying on pure olive oil. Then they added laurel oil. After that, the mixture was boiled for long hours inside giant stone cauldrons. Then it was poured onto a wide floor to cool slowly. After it solidified, it wasn't poured into molds. Instead, workers walked over the warm soap slabs with their bare feet. Not because they were poor, but because this was the best way to level the entire surface without breaking it. Then the strangest stage begins. A worker carrying a very long knife cuts the slab into hundreds, sometimes thousands, of identical cubes. Each piece is stamped by hand with the factory's seal, the way coins are stamped. But they didn't sell them right away. Instead, they did something that seems almost insane. They left the soap to age. Not for days, not for weeks. Sometimes 9 months, and sometimes a full year. During this period, everything changes. The dark green color gradually turns golden on the outside, while the core stays green. The soap loses a large part of its moisture. It becomes harder. It lasts longer, and it produces better lather. The longer it ages, the more valuable it becomes. Just like certain kinds of cheese or wine, soap was no longer just a cleaning tool. It became a luxury product. And soon merchants began carrying it on the backs of camels and on ships. From Aleppo to Cairo, then Constantinople, then Venice, then Marseille. And with every journey, demand grew. In Europe, people weren't just buying a bar of soap. They were buying the way it was made. And within a short time, European cities began trying to copy it. The city of Marseille in France, then Genoa, then Venice, all tried to copy the recipe, but it wasn't easy, because the best soap didn't depend only on the recipe. It depended on something else, something that couldn't be copied easily. Olive oil. The purer the oil, the better the soap. And because of this, olive trees became part of an entire economy. Not for food, but for soap. And suddenly, a small piece could change the trade of an entire city. Taxes were imposed on it, ports competed over it, and rulers protected its industry. But while Islamic cities were making the best soap in the world, Europe was about to enter one of the most contradictory periods in the history of cleanliness, the period in which people began to fear bathing itself. Doctors advised against washing the body, and kings might live for years without a single bath. And that wasn't because of laziness, but because they were convinced that water could kill you. This might seem impossible today, but for several centuries, some of the most famous doctors in Europe gave one piece of advice: avoid bathing. Not because it was unnecessary, but because they believed it was dangerous. After the fall of the Roman Empire, most public baths disappeared. Cities shrank, water systems collapsed, and cleanliness became something completely different from what it had been. But the real reason appeared later, with the epidemics. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, it killed tens of millions of people within a few years. Entire cities disappeared, and whole families left with no survivors. But no one knew what caused the disease. No one had discovered bacteria yet, or viruses, or germs. So people began looking for another explanation. And one of the most widespread explanations was that bad air carried the disease. What later became known as miasma theory. If the smell was bad, then the air must be poisonous. And if the air was poisonous, then opening the skin's pores with hot water might allow that air to enter the body. And from here, the fear began. Not of dirt, but of water itself. Some doctors advised people to wash only their hands and face. As for the whole body, it was better to stay dry. They believed that clean clothes were more important than clean skin. And so, changing shirts became a sign of cleanliness, not bathing. As for perfume, it became the preferred solution. Instead of removing odors, people covered them up. In European palaces, perfume bottles were sometimes more expensive than gold. Roses, jasmine, musk, amber, all in an attempt to hide one thing: the smell of humans. Even some kings, who we consider today symbols of luxury, rarely bathed. And this subject is surrounded by many myths and exaggerations. But what's certain is that full bathing wasn't a daily habit for the upper classes the way it is today.
At that time, this seemed like a rational decision. And in the streets, the situation wasn't any better. Clean water was rare. Sanitation barely existed. Garbage accumulated in the roads. And human and animal waste was thrown outside homes. Bad smells were part of daily life. Some travelers even wrote that they could smell cities before they saw them. But while Europe feared water, the Islamic world was moving in the completely opposite direction. There, cleanliness wasn't just a habit, it was worship. Ablution several times a day, and full washing on many occasions. And public baths were widespread in cities like Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and Cordoba. And soap wasn't a rare commodity, it was part of daily life. And so when Europeans arrived at Eastern cities during the Crusades, they weren't only amazed by the architecture, nor the markets, nor the wealth, but by something else that seemed extremely simple. People were bathing regularly and using soap far better than anything Europe had known. And when these soldiers and merchants returned, something came back with them that they didn't carry by sword nor by force. They carried it in their bags, pieces of soap, and a recipe that would change an entire industry in Europe. But soap would remain a product for the wealthy, until something happened that no one expected. Something that would transform it from a luxury commodity into a product that exists today in every home on earth. For thousands of years, making soap was like making bread. Every city had its own recipe, and every family had its own method. There were no giant factories, no brands, no identical pieces. Each piece was slightly different from the other. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and within a few decades, everything changed. In the late 18th century, Europeans were consuming soap more than ever before. But the problem was in the price. Making soap was slow and expensive, and depended on raw materials that weren't always available. Animal fats, olive oil, and ash alkalis determined how much soap the world could produce. If the price of oil rose, the price of soap rose. If the harvest failed, soap disappeared. Then chemists entered the picture. In 1791, the French chemist Nicolas Leblanc invented an industrial method for producing sodium carbonate in massive quantities. This name might not sound important, but it was one of the most influential discoveries in the history of cleanliness. For the first time, soap makers no longer depended solely on plant ash. It became possible to produce alkaline materials inside factories, in huge quantities, and with consistent quality. And suddenly cost dropped, and production rose. Then came another discovery. In the 1860s, the Belgian chemist Ernest Solvay developed a cheaper and more efficient process for producing sodium carbonate. What he did for soap is similar to what printing presses did for books. Production became massive, and continuous, and cheap. But technology alone wasn't enough. There was another enemy: taxes. In Britain, the government imposed a tax on soap. Not a small tax. A tax that made soap closer to a luxury good. Some factories were even subjected to constant inspection to make sure they weren't producing a single piece without paying the tax. It was strange. Governments complained about disease, then made cleanliness more expensive. These taxes continued for decades, until governments began to realize that a cleaner society meant fewer diseases. Until governments began to realize that a cleaner society meant fewer diseases. And within just a few years, production jumped enormously. Then a new kind of company appeared. Companies that didn't just sell soap, they sold trust. Names like Peers and Lever Brothers and Procter & Gamble began to appear. A bar of soap was no longer just a mixture of fats and alkalis. It became a brand, elegant packaging, a distinctive scent, and a promise of cleanliness. And for the first time in history, people began asking for the company's name. Not just a bar of soap. But there was a problem. Despite all this production, and despite all this marketing, no one really knew why soap prevented disease. People knew that it cleaned. But cleaning isn't the same thing that prevents death. And a man was coming, who would try to convince the world that there were living creatures, invisible to the eye, that were killing humans. The world would mock him. Then he would prove that he was right. And soap would become one of the most powerful weapons in a war that no one knew existed. In the mid-19th century, medicine seemed to be entering a new era. Surgeons had become more skilled, hospitals had become larger, and instruments more advanced. But one thing hadn't changed. Patients were still dying. The reason wasn't failed operations, but what happens afterward. An operation might succeed completely. The patient talks, smiles, seems like they'll recover. Then, after 2 or 3 days, their temperature rises. The wound begins to discharge pus, the infection spreads. Then they die. Doctors called it surgical fever, as if it were a natural disaster, something that happens and cannot be prevented. Inside operating rooms, blood was a sign of experience. The dirtier a surgeon's coat, the more people respected him. Some surgeons wore the same coat for weeks, sometimes months. Old bloodstains weren't a source of shame, but a badge of honor. The instruments, rarely washed. The saw that amputated one patient's leg might be used minutes later on another patient, without cleaning. Today we know this sounds terrifying. But at that time, no one saw a problem, because the enemy was invisible.
Then a Frenchman began to propose an idea that seemed insane. His name was Louis Pasteur. He wasn't a surgeon nor a doctor, but a chemist. And he was studying why food spoils. Why does milk spoil? Why does wine turn into vinegar? And why does meat rot? Most scientists believed that decay appeared spontaneously, that life could arise from dead things. But Pasteur wasn't convinced. He designed a series of experiments using glass flasks with long curved necks. He boiled the liquids inside to kill any microorganisms present. Then he let air in, but dust couldn't reach it. Days passed, then weeks, and nothing spoiled. But the moment the flask's neck was broken and dust reached it, decay began, again and again and again. Pasteur concluded that there were living organisms extremely small floating in the air, invisible, but present, and they were the cause of decay. If these organisms spoiled food, could they spoil humans too? It was a revolutionary idea, and terrifying. Not everyone believed it. In fact, many doctors refused to believe it. How could invisible creatures kill a human? But there was another doctor who had reached this conclusion years before Pasteur. Not through the laboratory, but through death. In a public hospital in Vienna, there were 2 maternity wards. In the first ward, women were dying in huge numbers. As for the second ward, deaths were far fewer. The strange thing was that both buildings were inside the same hospital. Same food, same air, same water. But one thing only was different. In the first ward, the doctors came directly from dissecting corpses. As for the second ward, the midwives performed no dissections at all. The doctor who noticed this, his name was Ignaz Semmelweis. And in a moment that would change the entire history of medicine, he asked the doctors to do something that seemed insulting to them: to wash their hands before touching patients. And at first they laughed. In 1847, inside the Vienna General Hospital, Ignaz Semmelweis did not invent a new medicine, nor did he create a new medical device. All he did was place a basin filled with chlorinated lime solution at the entrance of the maternity ward. Then he issued a simple order: before any doctor touches any patient, wash your hands. It wasn't a suggestion, it was mandatory. If anyone refused, they wouldn't enter. The doctors began to complain. The solution had a harsh smell, and it left the skin rough and cracked. But they carried out the orders. Then the numbers began to change. Not gradually, but suddenly. In the ward where nearly 1 out of every 5 mothers had been dying, the death rate collapsed to almost 1%. In some months, not a single mother died at all. The difference was so large that it could no longer be ignored. The same hospital, the same doctors, the same patients. The only thing that changed was hand washing. Today, the conclusion seems obvious, but for 19th century doctors, it was an insult. If Semmelweis was right, that meant they themselves were the ones killing their patients, not intentionally, but with their own hands. And it was easier to reject the idea than to accept it. Some doctors began to mock him. Others said the drop in deaths was just a coincidence. And some accused him of exaggerating in interpreting the results. The problem was that Semmelweis couldn't explain why his method worked. He could see the results, but he didn't know that germs existed, and Pasteur hadn't published his theory yet. He was asking people to believe something he himself couldn't see, and this made his mission nearly impossible. He wrote reports, he sent letters, he tried to convince senior doctors across Europe. But most of them didn't respond, and those who did respond rejected the idea. Then he began to lose his temper. Each new letter was angrier than the last. He accused his colleagues of killing women and described some of them as murderers, even if they didn't mean to. He wasn't wrong about the result, but he lost everyone with his approach. Little by little, he became isolated. His career came to a stop. He lost his position, and his friends began to distance themselves from him. And in 1865, he was admitted to a mental asylum. To this day, historians don't know exactly what happened to him there. But what we do know is that he tried to escape, so the guards beat him violently. His hand was injured by a wound. The wound began to fester. Then the infection spread throughout his body, and after only 2 weeks, he died. The irony is almost unbelievable. The man who spent his life trying to convince the world that unclean hands transmit disease died from an infection that entered through a wound in his own hand. He was only 47 years old, and he never lived to see the world admit that he had been right. A few years later, a French scientist named Louis Pasteur would come and prove that germs really do exist. Then a British surgeon would come and turn this idea into a revolution inside operating rooms. And suddenly, hand washing would become not just a habit, but a law. And the bar of soap would no longer be just a tool for removing dirt, but the first line of defense between life and death. By the 1860s, most surgeons had become faster than ever before. Amputating a leg might take less than 3 minutes. Removing a tumor had become possible. Even anesthesia was beginning to spread. But despite all this progress, there was one number that refused to drop: the number of deaths. In some hospitals, a patient would survive the operation, then die days later, not because of the surgery, but because of infection. And doctors gave it a comfortable name: complications. One word, hiding behind it, thousands of deaths. In the city of Glasgow, there was a young surgeon named Joseph Lister. He was reading the research of a French man named Louis Pasteur, and while reading, he paused at one idea. If germs spoiled food, then why wouldn't they spoil wounds too? It was a simple idea, but its consequences would change medicine forever. Instead of trying to treat infection after it happened, Lister decided to prevent it from the start. There was a chemical compound used at that time to reduce the smell of sewage water. Its name was carbolic acid, known today as phenol. Lister began washing surgical instruments with it, then bandages, then wounds. Then he asked his team to clean their hands before operations. The results were astonishing. In operations that sometimes killed half the patients, deaths dropped in a way no one had ever seen before. Wounds no longer rotted at the same rate. Open fractures, which had often meant death or amputation, became treatable. But, as had happened with Semmelweis, not everyone believed it. Some surgeons mocked his spraying of phenol. Others said he was wasting time. Some described him as obsessed with cleanliness. But one thing couldn't be mocked: the numbers. In the hospital where he worked, patients lived, and in other places, they died. And within a few years, hospitals in Britain, then Europe, then America, began applying his ideas. And for the first time, doctors began washing their hands, not because they wanted to remove blood, but because they wanted to remove something they couldn't see. And here, the role of soap changed forever. It was no longer a way to remove smell, or fat, or mud. It became part of medicine itself. At the start of the 20th century, hospitals began installing wash basins inside operating rooms. Then sterile gloves appeared. Then masks. Then steam sterilization. All of these things started from one question: what if the enemy was too small to see? And as time passed, deaths began to drop. not just because doctors became more skilled, but because they stopped transmitting germs with their own hands. But while medicine was changing quickly, the outside world was still lagging behind. In the streets, in schools, and in homes, most people weren't washing their hands regularly. And soap wasn't present in every home. It was still a product many couldn't easily afford. But that would change. Not because of a doctor, nor because of a scientist, but because of advertising, and factories, and brands. And for the first time in history, companies would begin selling cleanliness itself. By the early 20th century, the question was no longer, do people need soap? It became, which soap will they buy? And for the first time in history, the biggest battle no longer took place inside laboratories, but inside consumers' minds. In the 19th century, most people bought unnamed bars of soap. A brown-colored piece, its smell strong, its only function removing dirt. But with the arrival of giant factories, everything changed. Companies began selling not soap, but the feeling of cleanliness. Brands began to appear. Every company promised its soap was purer, whiter, gentler on skin, better for children, more luxurious. And for the first time, the shape of the soap bar became almost more important than its ingredients. Then came advertising. In newspapers first, then on the radio, then in cinema, then on television. You no longer saw a bar of soap. You saw a happy family, a laughing child, a smiling woman, an elegant man. The message was clear. If you want to be like them, buy this bar. And within a few decades, soap companies became among the biggest advertisers in the world. They spent millions of dollars to convince people of something their ancestors had never even thought about. That scent was part of identity. Before that, a person's natural smell was ordinary. Everyone smelled roughly the same way. But advertising changed this concept. Suddenly, the smell of sweat became a social enemy, and a pleasant scent became a mark of success. This wasn't just a marketing campaign. It redefined the meaning of cleanliness. From removing dirt to removing any smell, even if you weren't actually dirty to begin with. Then a new kind of competition emerged. Soap no longer competed with soap. It began competing with industrial detergents. In the 1940s and 50s, chemists produced new compounds that cleaned faster and worked even in hard water. And soon the markets filled up with laundry liquids, dish soaps, shampoos, and shower gels, all doing roughly the same job, just in a different way. And suddenly, traditional bar soap began losing its place. In many homes, it disappeared from the kitchen sink, then from the bathroom sink, then even from the shower. Replaced by plastic bottles people squeeze once, then throw away months later. But the interesting thing is that the chemistry didn't change much. Whether it was a bar of soap, shower gel, or shampoo, the basic goal stayed the same: make water do something it couldn't do on its own. Then came the 21st century, bringing with it a new enemy nobody expected. It wasn't a disease, it wasn't an epidemic, but fear of germs. Products carrying the phrase "kills 99.9% of bacteria" began filling stores. People started sterilizing everything: hands, desks, phones, doorknobs, shopping carts, even toys. Then came the COVID pandemic, and within weeks, soap disappeared from store shelves around the world. People stood in long lines, not to buy food first, but to buy soap. A scene repeated in dozens of countries at the same time. And after more than 5,000 years, the world returned to the same truth our ancestors discovered without understanding why. Washing your hands could save your life. But despite everything we've learned, there's still a question that hasn't been settled to this day. Are we even using soap the right way? And why doesn't soap kill bacteria? And yet it still succeeds at removing them better than many disinfectants. In 2020, while almost the entire world was living inside their homes, there was one piece of advice repeated more than any other: wash your hands. Not once, not twice, but dozens of times every day. The strange thing is, this advice wasn't new. It wasn't a modern medical invention. And it didn't come from an advanced laboratory. It had existed for thousands of years. The only difference is that we finally came to understand why. For a very long time, humans believed that dirt was only what they could see: mud, dust, oil stains, traces of food. If it disappeared, the hand had become clean. But the real world didn't work that way. Beneath the surface of your skin, on doorknobs, on your phone, there exists an entire world you cannot see with the naked eye. Billions of microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, and viruses. Some of them harmless, some protect you, and some need only a single chance. Here is where soap comes in. And ironically, soap isn't a super killer. It's not an acid, it's not a poison, and it doesn't chase down germs the way many people imagine. Instead, it does something much smarter. Every molecule of soap is like a tiny matchstick. It has one end that loves water and another end that loves fat. And this simple idea changes everything. Most of what sticks to your skin, water alone can't carry away. Natural oils, sweat, food residue, fat, and even many microbes cling to this greasy layer. That's why you can rinse your hands with water alone for several seconds, and a large portion of what's on them stays right where it was. But when you add soap, millions of tiny molecules begin wrapping around every droplet of fat. Each molecule grips it from one side and grips the water from the other. Then, that fat turns into microscopic little spheres, easily carried away with the water, disappearing down the sink drain. Not because it died, but because it was carried away. As for some viruses, the story is even more dramatic. Viruses like coronavirus and influenza are surrounded by an extremely thin, fatty envelope. It's like a tiny bubble. That envelope is its armor. And without it, it can't infect any cell. And when soap touches it, it doesn't attack the virus itself. It attacks its envelope. It breaks down the fatty layer, the same way oil dissolves off a dirty dish. And within moments, the virus collapses into pieces, no longer capable of doing anything. That's why the most important weapon in facing one of the biggest pandemics in history wasn't a new medicine, nor a complex device, but a bar of soap costing no more than a few dollars. And here appears the paradox that makes the history of soap one of the strangest stories in the history of civilization. Humans made soap before they knew atoms existed, before they knew bacteria existed, before they knew viruses existed, before they invented the microscope, and before they understood why it even worked. 5,000 years of trial before science arrived to explain what practice had already known. Remember the doctor from the beginning of this story. He walked into the delivery room after finishing an autopsy. His hands looked clean, but he was carrying something no one could see. If he had known what we know today, he might have gone home that evening having saved dozens of lives instead of losing them. Soap didn't change history because it's fragrant, nor because it makes a beautiful lather, nor because it makes our hands look cleaner, but because it cut the chain of death transmission before humans even knew that chain existed. And today, every time you press a soap dispenser or pick up a small bar beside the sink, you're using an invention older than the Roman Empire, older than Christianity, older than Islam, older than most languages spoken by humans today. An invention that stayed with us while empires fell, wars ended, kingdoms disappeared. and the world changed countless times. It's just a mixture of water and fat and alkali. But this simple mixture has saved and still saves more human beings than many of the greatest inventions in history. Soap isn't just a thing beside your sink. It never was.